To add new employees, the first step is to create a data transfer object. In the models folder, let's create a DTOs folder. And inside it, we're adding a new class called add employee form. This model will have the same properties as the employee model, except for the ID, since we don't need to pass an ID in our form. And for validation, we're going to add a required data annotation on top of each of these properties. Then in the employee service interface, we can create a new method that we will implement in the employee service. And we are only going to return a base response. So we need to create a new base response object and then use a try catch block. Then a using statement for the creation of the DB context. And when adding a new employee, we need to map the add employee form into the employee model. That's because the context expects an employee model. So we need to make sure we are passing the correct object. Then we're going to save the changes, and we will store the result of calling that method in a variable that will define our response. The save changes async method returns an integer, and that represents the number of objects that were written to the database during the operation. So in this case, a successful response would be 1, since we are adding 1 record to the database. So in that case, we are setting the status code to 200 and the message to employee added successfully. If the result is other than 1, we return a 400 error, which is a client error with an error message. If the try block fails, we're going to catch an exception and set the status code to 500 for server error with the appropriate message. And of course, we need to return that response. So now we can create a new Blazor component, and that will be the add employee. And our first step will be to inject the employee service. We also need to add a page directive to set the route for this page. We need to add a property for the add employee form. And we will add a method that will be called when our employee form is submitted, which will be responsible for calling the service. When we call the add employee method in the service, we will store the response in a variable. And for now, we're not going to do anything with this response. We're going to use it later to tell the user if the operation was successful or not. So for now, after the form is submitted, we're going to call the navigate to method of the navigation manager, routing to the root of the application, which means we'll return to the employees table. For the UI, you're going to add a card tag and add a few HTML and CSS elements that will wrap our form. Then we create an edit form component, which is built into Blazor, and we have this model parameter, which we are setting to the add employee form object. And if the submission is valid, we are calling the add new employee method. And if it's not, we're going to show a validation summary with the validation errors. And then we can create our first input. We can use the input text tag, which is a Blazor component, with a Bootstrap class, an ID for the floating input styling, and a placeholder also for that styling. And we need a bind value so we can associate that input with one of the properties of the add employee form. We're also going to have a label, and I need to change the value in bind value to capital letter. And we can run the app to see what our input looks like so far. And if we navigate into the add employee route, we can see the result, and it looks somewhat decent, and our floating input works. And before adding the new inputs, let's go to the nav menu so we can add a button for the add employee form, so we make development faster. And I'm just going to duplicate the logout navigation link and modify it so it suits the add employee link. With that, we can add our next input. So we're duplicating the name input and modifying it for the salary property. Just don't forget to change it to input number. And for the type input, we want to show a drop down with the possible types. So this input will be slightly different. We need to have an input select and then create an option for each employee type. And I do that with a for each loop, which will loop through the possible employee types. For each option, I'm showing the display name of the type, but as a value, I have to pass the type itself because we're storing it as a number in the database. And we need to change the Bootstrap class for this control. We need to say form select, otherwise it won't show the appropriate styling. And if we test, our drop-down works, and we can duplicate that same code for the position, making the modifications for the position property. Then we can duplicate the input for the name and adjust it for the image URL. And to finalize, we need to create a button that will submit this form using a few Bootstrap classes. And that's it. We can test and see if it works. If we put a breakpoint on line 58 and hover over the add employee form object, we can check if all the inputs were passed correctly. And in our employee table, we can see that the new employee was added correctly. In the next lesson, let's see how we can update and delete employees.